Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's MarkMonitor webinar, The Deep Web, the Darknet, and Bitcoin, where we'll be discussing how they are accessed and used, the types of activities occurring there, and the role that Bitcoin is playing. I'm Gina LaFleur of MarkMonitor. Before we begin our presentation, I'd like to run everyone through a few housekeeping items. During today's webinar, only the host will be able to see the list of all attendees. All participants' lines will be muted to ensure there is no background noise. Following our presentation, we will be holding a Q&A session. If you have a question at any time for our speaker during the presentation, feel free to submit it using the Q&A tab located on your screen. You can also submit your questions at the end of the session. For any questions our speaker won't have time to answer today, we'll make sure to follow up with you after the event. We are recording today's webinar, and we plan to send out a follow-up email to all registrants with a link to the recording and presentation slides within the next couple of days. With that, I'd like to go ahead and introduce our speakers for today's presentation. We are joined by MarkMonitor brand protection experts, Elisa Cooper and Akino Chikada. Elisa Cooper is Vice President of Product Marketing for MarkMonitor. With 13 years of direct experience, she is an expert in the field of online brand protection and domain name management. Elisa has worked closely with many Fortune 1000 companies in assisting with domain and brand protection policy development. She has spoken and written extensively on these topics and is the chair of ICANN's business constituency and is an active member of the International Anti-Counterfeiting Coalition and the Online Trust Alliance. Akino Chikada is a Senior Product Marketing Manager for the MarkMonitor Brand Protection Solutions. She started her career in public relations and marketing in London and has worked in Europe, Asia, and the United States. She has led and served interim roles in global marketing strategies, product marketing, events management, public relations, corporate communications, and regional marketing. Akino holds a Bachelor of Arts from the University College of London, a Master of Science from the London School of Economics, and has trilingual fluency in English, Italian, and Japanese. So with that, I'll go ahead and turn things over to Elisa and Akino to get us started.
Hi, everyone. So thank you for joining today's session. Today we'll talk about the deep web and the darknet. We'll clarify terminologies, review the types of content you'll find between the deep web and also the different contents you'll find in the darknet. We'll also talk about Tor and how it works. And then Elisa will talk about underground marketplaces, the role of Bitcoin, strategies for mitigating abuse, and as Gina just mentioned, we'll end it with a Q&A session. So let's start by clarifying terminologies and understanding the internet landscape. So the surface web. The surface web is considered as like our regular websites that can be indexed and searchable with our standard search engines. What's surprising is that only this surface web represents only 4% of the internet. The rest of the 96% is the deep web, which is unindexed websites. And we'll talk about this shortly. But also there's a portion, the dark web and the darknet. And I want to clarify, the dark web is web content that exists on the darknet, and the darknet is the network that can only be accessed with specific software configuration or authorization. And there are two typical darknet types. The first is friend-to-friend networks, and the second is anonymity networks such as Tor, which we'll also talk about. But if you look at the big picture, the deep web is hundreds of times larger than the surface web. So what's in the deep web? As mentioned, 96% of the content exists in the deep web. That's over 7,500 terabytes of content. It's really big. And the different types of content that exist in the deep web include dynamic content, unlinked content, private web pages, software, the list goes on, as you can see. So, for example, the deep web content. It's not everything in the deep web is seedy. There are forms, logins, and logins such as corporate internet, that's all considered part of the deep web. Also social media sites, that's part of the content. Also pop-ups, so as you see on the right-hand side, the screenshot, you'll see a little pop-up that has no URL. Content like that is also part of the deep web. So deep web, so these are like suspicious content of concern. So any unindexed web pages are part of the deep web, and they're suspicious content such as selling counterfeit or gray market goods, collecting user credentials, such as phishing sites, also unindexed web pages that are disseminating malware. Also, there's false associations and conducting consumer scams. Also part of the deep web is P2P sites where piracy is taking place, marketplaces where counterfeit, gray market, and unauthorized goods are being sold, and also social media where there are lots of impersonating web pages. So how are consumers directed to the deep web? And apologies, there are many, many different ways consumers are directed to the deep web. So for example, social media, websites, mobile apps, paid search ads, and emails, especially emails. There are lots of emails that you receive that will have a call to action that directs you a deep web page, also spam mails that are directing you to that page. And now let's shift gears. What is the Darknet? The Darknet, within the Darknet, both web surfers and website publishers are entirely anonymous. Anonymity is usually achieved by using Tor, and there are also other alternatives such as I2P and Tails, but Tor is probably the most well-known out of all of them. And there are a number of marketplaces, underground marketplaces, also known as the online black market. In 2013, the FBI took down the first Silk Road, and I think that that's when a lot of the media and press covered the Darknet and the Silk Road, so that had a lot of press coverage. But since there's lots of other underground marketplaces, such as Abraxas, Agora, Nucleus, and Elisa will be covering those and sharing some exciting examples about what's in that. But before we go through that, let's talk about Tor. What is Tor? So the acronym for Tor is the Onion Router. It's a free software which enables anonymous communication. It was originally developed in the mid-90s by the United States Naval Research. And today, 2.5 million people access Tor on a daily basis. So who's accessing it? Well, criminals, hacktivists, strong privacy advocates who don't want their online actions to be tracked by officials or advertisers, journalists, especially if they're searching for dangerous and sensitive information, and law enforcement agencies. And there are different benefits for using Tor, including users can remain anonymous, activities remain untraceable, also resources can remain hidden. So how is Tor accessed? Well, for those of you, if you've never accessed Tor before, it's surprisingly really easy. In this site, you'll see a screenshot, and it's as easy as just downloading that Tor, which takes just a couple of minutes. And as you can see, once you downloaded it, you'll see this web page. And you'll see on the bottom left-hand side, it says what's next. And basically, that's where it shares tips to how to fully browse anonymously. And then on the right-hand side, you'll see that it's basically asking for volunteers to participate. So the Tor is a network. The Tor Network is a group of volunteer-operated servers that allows people to improve their privacy. In fact, the more people use it, the more anonymity will be protected. So how does it work? Tor is a distributed anonymous network. At a high level, it distributes your transactions over several places on the internet. Data packets on the Tor network take a random pathway through several relays that cover your tracks, so no one at any single point can tell them where the data comes from or where it's going. A private network path is therefore created, and no individual's relay ever knows the complete path that a data packet has taken. Tor software uses the same circuit for connections that happen for approximately 10 minutes, and any requests that are made later is then given a new circuit to keep people from linking your earlier actions to new ones. So Tor is always seeking for volunteers to run a relay. And as aforementioned, the more volunteers, the more it will secure anonymity. So with that, I'll pass it to Elisa.
Thanks, Akino. So what do you do once you get out there, and how do you sort of find your way around the darknet? Well, I'm going to take you through some of that, and then we're going to take a look at a popular underground marketplace so you can really understand what is going on out there. And as Akino said, I think I'd really like to reinforce the fact that it is relatively simple to get up and running with the Tor browser, to get out there and to start searching. Now, once you get out there, how do you search? So there are search engines available on Tor, so that's definitely one way. And what we're looking at here is a set of different search engines, and you can see there are quite a few. There's also a very popular website called the deep.web.com, and that also provides a lot of information and links to some of the more popular marketplaces. But really, there's a ton of information out there about where to go, what to access, how you can get there. So once you get that browser downloaded, there really is a plethora of information available to you to understand what is going on out there. Now, what is going on out there? So what is even sold on sort of a typical Tor marketplace? These are some statistics that we got from a marketplace called Abraxas, and you can see, a lot of what's sold out there are drugs. Now, some of those are illicit drugs, but there's also a fair amount of pharmaceuticals that are sold there as well. There is information being sold. There is piracy occurring. There's actually, you'll see in just a moment, there is actually a section on this particular marketplace where they specifically sell counterfeits. There's data, there are electronics, software, there are packages for hacking. There's really, if you're looking for something that is not legal, it's basically available out here on these marketplaces. Now, let's talk about sort of how you get to these marketplaces. Now, you may have heard, well, some of these marketplaces are hard to get to. You've got to sign up, and sometimes you have to get an invitation to join. That's true. Typically, all of the marketplaces will require you to register and to provide, standard credential information. They also ask for a PIN. So they ask for a fair amount of information. Now, some of them will not allow you to join unless you get an invitation. But this is pretty misleading. It took me just a few minutes to find an invitation. So I used a search engine, basically typed in something and, to look for an invitation for a particular marketplace. Lo and behold, I'm redirected to another forum site with a link. It was super easy to sort of get into these marketplaces. So for as much as people say, oh, well, you need to have these invitations and they're hard to access, I wouldn't say that's necessarily true across the board. The experience that I've had is that it's sometimes quite simple to get that invitation. I think the other thing that some people might be very surprised to know is some of these marketplaces are very sophisticated. Just like well-known marketplaces out there on the surface web, they provide information such as seller ratings, seller profiles, or basically your order history, just like you're used to seeing, so you can see what you've ordered in the past. Some of them have sort of online discussion groups where they share information about the products or what their experience was. So they're pretty feature-rich, actually, and so if you're thinking you're just going to see some sort of, very basic sort of listing of goods for sale, I think you might be surprised to see that they're actually quite sophisticated. So what does this actually look like? Well, let's take a look. This, you can see, is sort of a typical Tor marketplace. You can see, there are thumbnails. They've got things broken out. They show, you can see up here, my wallet, where it shows how much Bitcoin or Dash I have in escrow, and you can see also down here on the left-hand side the current exchange rates. And we're going to talk about Bitcoin in a bit more detail in just a few minutes, but all of the sites transact in cryptocurrency. Generally, all of them are accepting Bitcoin, and some of them accept other kinds of cryptocurrency like Dash, which was formerly referred to as Darkcoin. But let's dive in a little bit deeper and sort of look at what some of these listings actually look like. So we are now looking at sort of the listings for pirated software, and you can see there's a fair amount of pirated software. Some of this is stuff that you would normally just be able to purchase online, or you might be able to purchase at a warehouse store or some big box retailer. A lot of it is sort of well-known commercial software. Some of it is software to conduct other kinds of fraud, but some of it is just your standard commercial package software. Luxury goods are also a very hot item, I would say, on these marketplaces. And so, again, just kind of what you would expect is what you find out there. So if you're looking for personal goods, leather goods, watches, fancy pens, those types of things, these are all available and for sale, and specifically, you can easily find these on any of the marketplaces. Now, pharmaceuticals, as I had mentioned, those are also very popular in many of these marketplaces. I mean, certainly there's a lot of illicit drugs, and that's a big part of what they're selling. But pharmaceuticals, popular pharmaceuticals, are also for sale on the Darknet, and something that I think pharmaceutical companies should at least be aware of and paying some attention to. Now, the interesting thing about the Darknet is, unlike other marketplaces that are on the surface web, there's no real need to try to obscure the names of things or use typos or misspellings to, sell goods or try to in any way cover your tracks, because it's all anonymous anyway. So it's very easy to just basically search for a brand name. You don't have to search for misspellings or typos or some code word for it. You can easily find it. And what I find particularly interesting is that there is an entire section on this particular marketplace that is focused specifically on counterfeits, which is obviously something you're not going to see elsewhere, but is something that is common, I would say, in a situation where you've got some real anonymity. So again, you've got your luxury goods, but you also have other kinds of things like footwear. You might also see in the top left-hand corner that they're actually selling counterfeit currency as well. But there are a number of listings on this particular marketplace specifically called out for counterfeits. And then I think the one that is probably most troubling being sold on the marketplaces is account information, bank account information, credential information, and so there's quite a bit of this as well as credit card information and other kinds of account information, bank accounts, credit card accounts, credential lists, things of that nature. So again, very, very concerning. Whether or not, information actually shows up when it's ordered, I think that's not known. But again, they do have seller ratings. So if you're purchasing something from a seller who has a good rating, it's possible that you will be provided with whatever it is that you've purchased. So I think it's really pretty shocking. I think the one takeaway that I would like to give you on this is that I think there's a lot of sort of mystery, and people are afraid, and some people don't want to know. They certainly don't want to go out there and look themselves. But I will tell you that just accessing this information was very simple. I think, the one thing I would say is, look, some of these people are people that are trying to buy illicit drugs, and, I don't think they're trying to cater to Internet geniuses. They're trying to sell their illegal goods, and so, they want to be found by them. They want to be found in some ways. They don't want to be found by law enforcement, but they do want to sell their goods, and so it is absolutely possible to go out and find this stuff, and it's available. Now, how many people are actually making purchases and how widespread is it? We don't know really that information yet, and we probably won't ever really know because of the anonymity. But you should absolutely be aware that it's out there and it's available. And I think there's, specifically for luxury goods companies and other types of companies, I think, a question to ask, and we'll address this later on, is this a point in the channel where sort of massive amounts of goods are being distributed? Again, it's a really hard question to answer, but it's something that's worth giving some thought to. So, the next question is well, what role does Bitcoin even play in all of this? Well, as you just saw, these sites are utilizing Bitcoin to conduct their transactions. And some other kinds of cryptocurrency are also accepted sometimes. So Dash, which was formerly known as Darkcoin, and there's a Litecoin. There's actually a number of different cryptocurrencies out there and available. But Bitcoin is the one that seems to be most popular with these sites on Tor. So how does Bitcoin work? Well, this is, for those of you who don't know, Bitcoin is truly, truly fascinating in the way that it works and the way the transactions are actually completed. And sort of at a high level, Bitcoin uses basically some peer-to-peer technology, and there really is no central banking authority. It's all distributed. And the way that it works is there are what they call miners who are essentially completing the transactions. And as they're completing the transactions and doing the work of moving money from one place to another, they are being rewarded with Bitcoin themselves. Now, the way the transactions are actually processed is they are completed electronically using uniform resource indicators, and those can be embedded in QR codes and used on your mobile device, or they can be provided as a piece of information. Now, again, I think the fascinating point here is that, this is a particular currency that currently has 13 million Bitcoin in circulation. Now, the current value of a Bitcoin is around $293. Actually, I just checked just before we logged on today. When I had prepared this, it was closer to $295. It has gone up and down quite a bit. But it's very interesting to note that there will never be any more than 21 million Bitcoin, and that's expected to occur by the year 2140. So I guess the question is, why Bitcoin? Why do these sites use Bitcoin? And so there's some factors that really lend itself to anonymity and why basically Tor and these underground marketplaces would want to rely on Bitcoin as opposed to using something like credit cards or money transfers. So the first thing, it's really a defining feature of Bitcoin is that it is not controlled by any one central authority. And as I mentioned, basically, these miners are processing transactions together, and everyone sort of makes a piece of this network, and the machines are all working together, but it is really a decentralized approach, very different from other kinds of financial institutions. Secondly, it's anonymous. So Bitcoin addresses are not associated to names, addresses, or any personally identifying information. 3 is very fast. So transactions can be completed within minutes, and as soon as the Bitcoin information is sent, it can be processed almost within, literally just a matter of minutes. The other thing, though, that you need to know about Bitcoin is that it's not reversible. So once you send the Bitcoin, or once the Bitcoin information has been sent, there is absolutely no getting that information back. They are gone forever. And so that's something I think probably that also lends itself to these kinds of marketplaces. There's no return policy, if you will. Once you make your purchase, you're pretty much resigned to living with that purchase, and there is no way to essentially reverse it. So let's sort of switch gears a little bit. I mean, we've talked about like what's going on in these marketplaces. We've shown you what exactly can be purchased. We talked a little bit about Bitcoin. But now let's talk about sort of how can we actually identify abuse both in the deep web as well as the darknet. I'm going to start off by talking about abuse in the deep web first. And when I talk about the deep web, I'm really excluding the darknet. So as Akino mentioned, you know, abuse in the deep web is occurring in many different places. So unindexed websites. Now, for instance, you can think about cyber-squatted domain names, close matches, things that somebody might type into a browser. Those domain names can point to web pages that are doing things like, you know, selling counterfeit goods or collecting credential information or conducting malware, but they don't necessarily need to be indexed. And because they're not indexed, and again, the interesting thing about the deep web is that even though these sites are not indexed, they are still knowable. There are still ways to get at this information. So if it's a domain name, certainly there's who is information. If it's on a social media site, you've got contacts at social media sites. If it's occurring somewhere else, you always have an option potentially to request a takedown by an ISP. But so if we're talking about sort of unindexed web pages that might be collecting or drawing or gathering traffic because it's a close match to a known domain name, that's definitely one place. Search engine ads, so the ads that pop up when you're doing a search for a particular keyword, oftentimes, and in many cases, up to 90% in some cases, we're seeing that the resolving pages coming from those paid search advertisements, those pages are not indexed. And again, what that means is it's not knowable, it won't be found by your standard search engine. So again, that's something that's occurring in the deep web, but again, it's also something that's knowable because if you're, utilizing a service to monitor for paid search advertisements and you're monitoring your keyword usage, you'd be able to find that information. Mobile apps are another place where potentially within an app, it might be redirecting out to, again, an unindexed website. Marketplaces, I think, probably many of you are already monitoring marketplaces, but because that content is dynamic, it's not necessarily indexed by the search engine. So that's a place where many of you are already searching the deep web and may not even be aware of it. Email is another source of direction or redirection to dark deep web pages again. But if you have a solution in place to be monitoring for email and where your brand is occurring, you again are already looking probably at the deep web and you may not know it. P2P and file sharing, again, that's part of the deep web, but if you've got a solution in place to be searching for that, again, you're already, like I said, maybe doing this and not just aware of it. And same thing with social media. Social media sites are also particularly behind any login screens. Those are in the deep web. And, obviously, it's very difficult to obtain information there, but, we do see abuse occurring there. So how can you actually mitigate abuse in the deep web? Well, as I had just mentioned, the good thing about the deep web is that in many cases, even though there is an attempt to hide identities or not be found by a search engine, there is still a way to uncover and address the abuse. So if it's a domain name, you've got access to things like CNDs, and of course, there's UDRPs and URS and a number of different strategies you can take if there's a domain associated to a site that is not indexed. There's a way to address abuse that's occurring there. You also have the option in many cases if you see abuse occurring on a website to request takedown via ISP, especially if there's copywritten activity. Of course, if there's fraud, there's always that potential as well. And, if you're seeing abuse on marketplaces or social media sites or mobile app stores, many of those already have policies in place where you can request takedown when something is occurring, whether it's abuse that's copyright in nature or trademark or other kinds of fraud. So there is, I mean, the good thing is with the deep web, it's definitely, much of it is definitely not only uncoverable, but it is addressable. Now, that said, I cannot say the same for the darknet. You know, this is a much different environment. And I think for most companies at this point, because it is still really evolving, I think you need to understand what your level of risk is. And I think there are certain kinds of companies that are at greater risk than others. And so the first, you know, sort of set of companies I think that are probably at greatest risk at this point are financial institutions. And I think, you know, most large financial institutions are probably already looking at the darknet. They're monitoring for credential information or account information. They're looking to see if any information has been exposed and is available. And so I think those types of companies are probably already doing this. I think also companies that really struggle with counterfeit distribution of goods should also determine, you know, if this is a way by which massive, you know, amounts of goods are actually being moved through the distribution channel. And so I think, you know, those two types of companies are probably most at risk at this point. And like I said, I think this is also really an evolving area. So, you know, this is probably likely to change, and I wouldn't be surprised if it changes a bit even in the next quarter to 2 quarters as we continue to see adoption rates grow. I think, you know, if you don't fall into one of those two different camps, then you should really determine whether or not you need some sort of regular monitoring, or you want to be doing some sort of regular monitoring of what's going on out there, or whether you just want to do some periodic monitoring and you just want to take a look and get a snapshot or an idea of what the problem looks like. And, you know, I think this is something that companies should be paying attention to. I don't think, you know, all companies need to go out and, you know, implement a program at this point, but again, I think it depends a lot on the type of vertical that you're in, you know, what your risk is, what we're talking about, and whether or not, you know, you're ready to start making that investment. Now, it's a much more difficult question to answer when we're talking about how to actually mitigate abuse in the darknet. And as we've talked about, because you have so much anonymity, online enforcement is very difficult. Now, sometimes there is a way to look at what's going on. And for instance, you know, if on a marketplace sellers have profiles and within their profiles they've actually put email addresses, then it may be possible to actually sort of connect the dots and use that email address to see if it might also be associated to a domain name and whether that domain name is associated to a website, and to gather some information that way. So that might be possible. You might also consider, depending, again, you know, what the issues are that you're facing, you might consider actually doing some test buys to really understand what is being sold, you know, whether or not it's counterfeit or if it's gray market or even if it's been stolen. So those are some things that you can do. I think, you know, again, it's going to be a lot about sort of resetting expectations in terms of what can be done. I think, you know, again, if you're in the financial services industry, you know, if you are identifying stolen account information or credential information, obviously clearly working with your own internal fraud departments would be one approach, and to work with them to allow them to determine what the next step should be. So, I mean, as you can see, I mean, it's really, I think we're still sort of, in some ways, early days, and I think we're still seeing a lot of this evolving. You know, this has been going on for quite a while, but I think is starting to garner more attention from sort of mainstream media, and so that is sort of piquing people's interest to go out and take a look and just to see what is going on out there. So I know that we have covered a ton of information, so I'm going to sort of stop at this point and see if there are questions. I see we have a few questions in the queue, so we do have a bit of time for it. So let's see, we'll start to look at some of these questions. So the first one, is there a way MarkMonitor can include searches in the deep web in the brand module? And so this question, I think, looks like was sort of asked early on, but just to answer that question, we are searching the deep web. When we're looking at, email that comes in and is sort of redirecting to pages, that content, may or may not be indexed. And when it's not indexed, and for the most part, you can imagine that if somebody is conducting a phishing scam or sending out spam, they really don't want that stuff found. So they're not necessarily indexing that information. But we find it because we're following those links, and we're able to then look at the page and see what's going on. I think, that's the same thing with sort of our paid search as well. So if, you're using our paid search capabilities, where we're looking at the advertisements that are appearing when keywords are entered into a search engine, and we follow those links, oftentimes, and I think I mentioned even in some cases, up to 90% of those pages that are the landing pages from those ads are not indexed, and so that means they're not searchable by search engines, but we are finding them. So it is something that we're doing today. I don't know, Akino, if there's anything else you would add.
No, I think that was a very eloquent answer. Thank you, Lisa.
Are there any plans to integrate potential counterfeit search results in MarkMonitor's marketplace portal, or possibly a separate Darknet tool? So at this point, we are offering landscape reports. So, if you are wanting to know what is going on out on the Darknet in these marketplaces, and you think, you sort of fall into one of these categories, that is something that we are offering. Right now, we are not integrated into the marketplaces module. Part of the reason is, we really focus on remediating issues. We're really all about enforcing. And right now, there's really no way, to automate enforcement on these underground marketplaces. So we don't have it in there, but it's something we're definitely keeping our eye on, and we do offer these sort of landscape reports. So that you have sort of an understanding of what is going on there with your brand. Here's an excellent question, and I don't know how to answer it, but how would you know if these Tor deep websites are legitimately illegitimate or not just honeypots by law enforcement? So, some of them that are out there, especially, it's an excellent question. I guess you never really know because there's so much anonymity, and you really don't know who's running them, except to say that some of them are written about quite a bit on the internet as being either reputable or not, not sending services or not fulfilling orders. I guess we never really know. So I think even ordering something through one of these marketplaces is a big unknown, whether or not what you order is actually going to show up. So I don't actually have a great answer for that, but I think it's an excellent point. So here's another question, and it is, you talked about accessing these sites through Tor, but could you actually access it without Tor? Is the need to go through Tor to allow you to browse anonymously? I'll answer that, Akino.
Okay.
And let me finish that. So let me repeat that. Is the need to go through Tor to allow you to browse anonymously, or do these sites require it to also protect them? So I think the question is, do you need Tor to get to these sites?
Well, yes, you do. Especially if you're talking about the Darknet. You absolutely need Tor, or as I mentioned, an alternative to Tor, such as I2P, or there are a few others out there. But if you want to access the Darknet, you absolutely need to. If you want to access the deep web, as Elisa mentioned, there's a whole other way that people can end up and surf the deep web, so to speak.
And probably one thing that we should mention, and it's pretty core for Tor sites, is that every site that requires a Tor browser to resolve ends in .onion. So, instead of, a .com or a .net, or of course any one of the hundreds of new GTLDs that are out there, instead of one of those occurring to the right of the dot, what you will always see for a site that requires Tor to resolve is something ending in .onion. So when you see that, you must use the Tor browser in order for it to actually resolve.
Great point.
So here's another question. How did 21 million Bitcoin by 2140 number come about? Is there no central authority or regulation? Who's to say this will implode or explode in the next 2 years? It's possible. I mean, this is sort of what's being predicted in terms of the rate at which the miners can actually create new blockchain, and that's sort of the method by which additional Bitcoin are generated. It's a prediction that the 21 million will occur by 2140. I would also say that the number itself, the 21 million, that's been defined by the program itself. That's how that program was defined. So that is not that cannot change. Whether or not the rate at which the miners work could change, that's a great question, and I can only sort of go on sort of what's being predicted at this point. So here's a question, and if I knew the answer to it, I would do something about it. And do I think the value of Bitcoin will go up as we approach 2140? I wish I knew.
I wish I knew too.
I wish I knew. So here's a question. Would a domain that has been delisted be considered in the deep web? So, I think anything that is not indexed, so we're talking about web pages as opposed to sort of domain names themselves. If there is a website and there is some code on the page that basically instructs search engines not to search that page, it would be considered, it would not be indexable. The search engines would not look at it, they would not index it. So if a domain name or a website has that piece of code on it, that's the instructions that the search engines look for in terms of whether or not they'll actually search that page and index that page. So here's a question. Would I advise working with law enforcement for Darknet investigations? I think it's worth a shot. I think it also depends on what kind of activity is going on. I think there are certain things that are going to be more difficult, and probably law enforcement is going to focus first on things like illicit drugs and, counterfeit currency as opposed to other things like, counterfeit handbags. But certainly, I think anytime you're dealing with law enforcement, the more information that you can gather up, present to them, that's helpful for them. And I know that, we've worked closely with law enforcement. We've had them at a number of our events, and that's always been the instruction that they've given to us, and that is, the more information that the brand owners can provide, that just helps law enforcement move things more quickly. Here's a question. Can MarkMonitor help me if I want to do a buy of counterfeit goods that my company sells? Yes, we can. So I would reach out to your client services manager, and we can certainly help to facilitate that. Let's see. I think I've actually sort of gone through all of the questions. Give it another minute or two to see if there are any questions. And I'm just going to wait another few seconds. Can you give us the link to Tor again? Yes. So I can tell you what it is right now, but you'll be able to see it in this presentation. But it's torproject.org. So that's TORPROJECT.org. And we will definitely get the slides and the information out. All right. Oh, so a question, have any purchases been made from these sites to validate that they can deliver goods as promised? Yeah, I think, that's a big unknown. We can rely on sort of the seller profiles and what they're saying about the types of products that are being delivered, and there's lots of reviews everywhere, but it's really hard to know, could that be, planted information? Are they just basically, are these all just scams? I think there's a lot of unknowns. But I think we do know clearly from the past, especially with Silk Road, that absolutely, there were transactions occurring, goods were being sent and received. So we know that it occurs. Whether or not a particular site or particular seller is reputable and doing what they're saying they're going to do, that we just don't know. Okay, I am going to, I think we probably covered all of the questions. I think I will pass it back over to you, Gina.
Great. Thank you, Elisa and Akino, for such a great presentation today. And I'd also like to thank everyone tuning in for their participation. Your questions always help draw out further information for those listening in. Now, as a reminder, we'll be sending out a follow-up email with a link to the webinar's presentation slides and a recording within the next couple of days. So you can be on the lookout for that email. That concludes our webinar for today. Thanks again for tuning in, and have a great day, everyone.